I mean, look, the inauguration was all very splendid. The Russians do pomp quite well. Great golden hall, his own limousines sweeping up and such like, presidential regiment on parade. Putin himself, though, seemed astonishingly bored by it. And in some ways, that for me was the real motif. I mean, this is a man who has basically stolen the presidency once again, who really has nothing new to offer and has been here before. So it was a sort of rather tired old man going through the motions. And frankly, it's hard to see where he can go from here. It was all very sumptuous and very carefully done. We saw lots of scenes of him walking along lengthy red carpets with great crowds of people sort of standing there applauding him or taking photos and selfies and things. But again, I felt that what really was struck me was you have this massive hall, a massive audience, and this very sort of solitary figure in the middle of it. I mean, even when he was reviewing the march past of the presidential regiment, there was a whole regiment of men who were there for him. There was a band and so forth, and even there, he just looked simply vaguely dyspeptic. This is not a man who seems to actually be connecting. He wasn't connecting with his soldiers. He wasn't connecting with the public. He was just simply the object of a lot of carefully choreographed presentation. In terms of Putin's own statement, look, this is why he still has elections. I mean, it's easy to think, well, why does he even bother having elections if he's going to rig them as comprehensively as he did? And remember, of the 87% vote that he claimed, there are some suggestions that up to half of those may well have been fabricated votes. So, it may well be that he actually had a minority of Russians backing him. But the point is, he goes through this whole political theatre just to try and convince other Russians that even if they're not happy with him, that the majority of people are. So it's an attempt to try and legitimize him. So this is it. It's an entirely circular process. He rigs an election, and then he uses that election to claim that he has a popular mandate. And then on the basis of that popular mandate, he does whatever he wants, and then he stands for election again. In terms of anti-war opposition, look, there is a lot of low-level opposition. We're still seeing brave Russians coming out in little sort of 1 or 2 person street protests, doing everything or anything from, writing graffiti on walls to firebombing draft boards, offices. So it is still there. The point is, it is not at all coordinated. That's the one thing that the state is actually very good at. It can't keep everyone under control, but what it can do is try and crack down as soon as you start to get people connecting and forming movements. So it's a kind of inchoate, low-level resistance. But again, this is one of the reasons why Putin is still very reluctant to launch a mobilization, because that's exactly the kind of thing that might force people to start talking together once again. We think of Putin and this great sort of macho persona he built up, but again, that was quite some years ago. And it was interesting. Look, I mean, I've been barred from Russia since 2022. But if I think of my last trip, which was right at the end of 2021, even there, while shamelessly eavesdropping on conversations in the metro and so forth, for the first time, I heard people referring to Putin as Starik, the old man, or else he's also sometimes known as grandfather. Again, this is for someone who built so much of his political persona on this kind of macho virility. It's clear that the age factor is important, but also more importantly, it just says something about his increasing inability to really connect with his own people. He doesn't travel much inside the country anymore. He doesn't really do walkabouts. He doesn't use the internet. I mean, this is a man who's clearly out of step, increasingly so. We tend to think, oh, he's a dictator. It doesn't really matter. But even dictators have to worry about the patience of their public, because after all, that's often what determines the difference between, dying in office and being immortalized in great statues and being hung from a lamppost. And I think the interesting thing is that even Putin seems to understand this. I mean, for example, a lot of his generals think he should order another mobilization wave, take another 1, 2, 3, 400,000 Russians, force them into the ranks in order to launch some kind of big offensive this summer. But Putin knows that would be politically very problematic, and therefore he shies away from it. Again, despite the macho persona, Putin is actually a very, very cautious political operator. So he does understand that on some level, he needs to worry about what the Russian people think. I mean, we're still, I mean, all we can go by is obviously the statements that are being made. And the statements that are being made are very much still playing that down, saying that they're getting quite enough volunteers. And in fairness, a lot of Russians are volunteering to fight. But so that kind of maintains the current force level rather than allowing it to be built up. So it could still happen. And if it does happen, it's beginning to get a bit late for that because there's quite a lag between declaring a mobilization, getting the guys in uniform, giving them their refresher training, and actually getting them on the field. So if he's going to do it meaningfully, he needs to do it soon. But again, it's a classic Putin thing that he dithers. And so he might end up calling a mobilization wave when by that point, August, or autumn rather, is already looming and it's a bit late. What we have seen after all over the years is this regime become increasingly intolerant, pretty much totalitarian. No one inside Russia, at least, is going to be able to emerge that way. But in some ways, look, it's not that leaders necessarily make the protests, it's the protests often make the leaders. One of the things that clearly the government is worried about is particularly as if the war goes on, sanctions continue, and the economy begins to overheat, you may well get real economic problems emerging. And I think what they're worried about is a kind of spontaneous, economically driven protest, some kind of, strikes, new wildcat trade unions emerging, and then someone will emerge from that. And the point is, because they or we don't know who, it could be a communist, it could be an ultranationalist, it could be all kinds of different figures. And the Kremlin will have no real sort of traction with these people. So although, the Navalny's wife and the movement that supported him is now still operating outside the country, and they're going to continue to try and have some kind of traction over Russians. I think basically what we can imagine is the next generation of protest leader is someone at the moment we have no idea of their existence, and they will emerge, as we've seen elsewhere in other kind of similar protest movements in authoritarian regimes, when the time needs them. If everything stays as it is, in other words, if Putin remains in adequate health, I don't think the country is, the economy is going to implode or anything like that. The war is obviously going to be the kind of key determining factor. But the fact of the matter is, if within a couple of years, neither Russia has forced Ukraine into making concessions, or Ukraine has likewise been able to launch some kind of major counteroffensive to push the Russians out, the war is probably going to just begin to sort of freeze naturally. There's a limit to how many casualties both sides can take. And so really, I think the situation is kind of quite depressingly stable. But the big difference is that I think Putin, the regime's capacity to cope with the unexpected is much, much less than it was before. I mean, in the past, Putin depended on his personal authority, his capacity to throw money at problems, and his control of the security forces. All three of those are now increasingly under question. So you might say, so long as nothing unexpected happens, then basically I think the next 6 years will just continue as is. But the point is, we know in politics that stuff happens. There will be the crisis, whether it's Putin dying or getting ill, whether it's in terms of some sort of reversal on the battlefield or some kind of economic shock, something like that. And that's when I think all bets will be off. So anyway, in some ways, although it's impossible to predict exactly what, it's the crises that are going to really determine what happens in the next 6 years. And this is it. I don't think Putin can step down now. I have a suspicion that before he invaded in 2022, he was actually toying with the idea because he did seem increasingly tired and frankly bored with much of the job. And I think he remember, he believed that this was going to be a 2-week walkover, walk in there, Zelensky will flee Kiev, he can impose a new puppet government, and then pull his troops out. And the Ukrainians would just shrug and accept it. Of course, it was total misreading of what the situation was. But, I think from his point of view, this was going to be the kind of crowning triumph of his presidency and would precisely make him so successful, so famous, so popular that he could actually afford to stand down. Because this is the point, in a system where there's no real rule of law, everything, your fortune, your family, your future, depends on whoever takes over after you. So I think, there was that sense that he felt it would have made him bulletproof, let's say. Now, though, absolutely not. I think the temptation to use Putin as a scapegoat for any successor will be just too great. And even if it's not, Putin is not a man who trusts easily. And therefore, even if in fact whoever he picks as a successor would actually be perfectly loyal to him, could Putin actually believe that today's promises of loyalty would still apply next year and the year after? I suspect not. So no, I think basically Putin is now stuck there. And although there are worse places to be stuck than the vastly rich dictator of a huge country, nonetheless, I think that he can't really stand out. It's the same position as, let's say, most mafia bosses. You know, you basically are there for life.